Thank you. Yes, Mr. O'Connor.
Grateful, sir. If I may, I will conclude my opening submissions with a few procedural matters.
Right.
And I will start belatedly by introducing core participants and those who represent them.
Thank you.
So, as you know, I appear as counsel to the inquiry with my learned friends Francesca Whitelaw Casey and Emily Pottle. The family, that is the family of Dawn Sturgess, and also Charlie Rowley, are represented by Michael Mansfield Casey, Adam Straw Casey and Jessie Nichols. Her Majesty's Government are represented by Catherine McGahey Casey, Ben Watson Casey and Georgina Wolfe. Operation Verbasco, that is for the uninitiated, the sort of combined efforts of the Metropolitan Police and Thames Valley Police,
right,
are represented by Lisa Giovanetti Casey, Jason Beer Casey, Aaron Moss, John Goss, Ruby Shrimpton, Gideon Bart and Edmund Gross. The Wiltshire Police are represented by John Beggs Casey and James Berry. The South West Ambulance Services NHS Foundation Trust is represented by Bridget Dolan Casey. And lastly, Sergei Skripal and Yulia Skripal are represented by Andrew Deakin.
Thank you.
So, hearing arrangements. The inquiry will hold hearings here in the Guildhall in Salisbury for the remainder of this week. Next week will be a non-sitting week. We will recommence our hearings at the International Dispute Resolution Centre in London the week after that, starting on Monday, the 28th of October. The hearings will then run through until the week of Monday, the 2nd of December, which we expect to be the last week of these open hearings. And your intention is to hear oral closing submissions on 1 or 2 days of that week. We'll be holding hearings all 5 days of this week here at the Guildhall.
Yes.
But for the weeks in London, we will have scheduled hearings on Monday to Thursday each week and hold Friday as a reserve day to be used if needed. A detailed witness timetable will be published in advance on the inquiry website. As I made clear in my submissions this morning, you will hold closed evidential hearings that will take place after the end of these hearings. That will enable us to explore evidential matters that you have determined are too sensitive to be dealt with in public at these open hearings. For reasons of security, no further detail will be published as to the timing or location of the closed hearings. Oral and written evidence, sir. During the hearings that start today, you will receive 2 broad types of evidence. There will be live evidence from witnesses who are called to give evidence before you, and then there will also be evidence presented to you in the form of documents. The primary role of questioning oral witnesses will be undertaken by counsel to the inquiry, that is myself, Ms Whitelaw and Ms Pottle. That is the normal procedure in public inquiries, which is laid down in Rule 10 of the inquiry rules. Core participants do have a right, under those rules, to apply to you for permission to question witnesses themselves. There's been some debate in preliminary hearings about how that system should operate. The inquiry has devised a protocol which provides, in summary, that core participants can make an application to you asking that certain issues or particular questions are raised with witnesses who are to be called. You then determine whether you wish the question or issue to be raised with that particular witness, and if so, whether you wish that to be done by us or by the representative of the core participant making the application. If you do grant core participants' representatives permission to question witnesses themselves, then they are required not to stray beyond the issues for which permission has granted, and they are also given a time limit. The evidence that oral witnesses give will be published on the inquiry website. A transcript will be published at the end of each day, and subject to security arrangements that I will address in a moment, a video, or in some cases an audio feed of witnesses' evidence will either be streamed via the website or uploaded to it following the hearing. I referred to documentary evidence. there is a considerable volume of documentary material that we anticipate you will wish to admit into evidence during the course of the hearings. Much of this material will be brought into evidence because it is referred to by oral witnesses as they give evidence to you. Other documentary material we will invite you to adduce as part of the background material. All documents that are adduced into evidence will be published on the inquiry website. Finally, sir, a word about special measures and security arrangements. I've already referred more than once to the particular sensitivities that arise as a result of the types of issues that you will be investigating. Those sensitivities have led to you taking certain procedural steps. Most starkly, and as we have already observed this morning, you have ruled that certain sections of the evidence cannot be heard in open at all, hence the closed hearings. And there are other decisions you have made that will affect the way the open evidence is heard in the coming weeks. You have agreed to permit some witnesses to give evidence anonymously, that is, without their names being published. Other witnesses will be permitted, exceptionally, to give evidence without their faces being seen and or their voices being heard by the public who are attending. Throughout the hearings, there will be an ongoing risk that a witness accidentally says something that is in fact sensitive and the subject of an order previously made by you, reserving discussion of that issue to a closed hearing. You've decided to take certain practical measures to limit the damage that would be done should such an inadvertent disclosure take place. Those measures include delaying the feed to the press annex and the internet by 10 minutes, and in some sessions, restricting access to the hearing room. Sir, these are all matters upon which you have deliberated carefully, having heard submissions at the preliminary hearings, and your rulings and directions are available for all to see on the inquiry website. I will not therefore go into any more detail about them now, but will simply emphasise two general points which are extremely important. First, these are limited measures. They will not impact greatly either on the transparency or on the essentially public nature of these proceedings. And as your rulings on these measures make clear, they are only being taken after careful consideration and ultimately because you are satisfied that they are both necessary and proportionate. Second, none of the measures that I have mentioned apply to you. You will see and hear all the witnesses. You will be aware of their real names. Your ability to understand and to assess the evidence as it is given will be unaffected.
Yes, thank you, Mr. O'Connor. All those arrangements, complex as they are designed to enable the maximum volume of information to be considered by the maximum number of people, and all of it by me.
Yes. I'm grateful. Right. Those are my submissions this morning.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Mansfield, are you going next? Mr. Straw. Mr. Straw, I'm going to aim to break one, and indeed others, I'm going to aim to break, largely for the sake of the necessary break for the shorthand writer, just this side of 4 o'clock, or at some convenient time as we run up towards then.
Thank you.
So if everybody could bear that in mind, I'd be grateful. We may, as I say, be sitting a little later than sometimes tonight.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Mr. Straw.
So Dawn was born in Salisbury on the 18th of June 1974 and lived in Salisbury throughout her life. She was dearly loved by her family, partner and friends who have all been devastated by her loss. This statement is made on behalf of Dawn's parents, Stan and Caroline Sturgess, her 2 sons, Aidan and Ewan Hope, her daughter, her sisters, Claire, Stephanie and Karen, and her partner, Charlie Rowley. The family remain open-minded about what happened. The purpose of this statement is to identify some of the key questions the family would like to be explored in the evidence during the open and closed hearings. The family team have divided the issues, and Mr. Mansfield and Mr. Nichols will focus on the UK authorities, what we've termed indirect responsibility, while I will focus on the Russian authorities, what may be termed direct responsibility for Dawn's death.
Allegedly, yes.
Allegedly. Precisely. And in the morning of Saturday, the 30th of June 2018, Charlie and Dawn were in Charlie's flat in 9 Muggleton Road, Amesbury, letting the day begin. Charlie had recently found a box containing what appeared to be Nina Ricci Premier Jewel perfume, and he gave it to Dawn that morning as a present. So far as Charlie could see, it was a genuine bottle of a fancy perfume. The bottle and the box in which it came had the Nina Ricci branding and colouring. The box indicated that this bottle was a vaporizer spray and contained 5.5 millilitres of eau de parfum. In fact, the bottle contained a deadly military-grade nerve agent, a specific type of highly pure Novichok. Apparently happy to have received the perfume as a present from Charlie, Dawn sprayed the substance on herself. Within a short time afterwards, she said she felt peculiar. She went into the bathroom, where Charlie found her lying in the bath, fully clothed. She had pinpoint pupils, was convulsing and drooling at the mouth. Charlie panicked and phoned for an ambulance. They advised him to give Dawn mouth to mouth. He had to lift her out of the bath and lie her on the floor. It seemed to him like ages until the ambulance arrived, and in the meantime, Dawn was rapidly deteriorating until she was struggling to breathe. Dawn was taken to Salisbury District Hospital, unconscious. Her family visited her there, and she was in a coma and on life support. On the 4th of July, results from blood tests confirmed that she'd been poisoned by Novichok. And then on 8th of July, in consultation with Stan and Caroline, a decision was made to turn off life support because Dawn could not have survived, and she died that evening. She had never recovered consciousness since she collapsed in the morning of the 30th of June. Because of the Novichok, the family were not allowed to bury Dawn's body as they wished and were not allowed to touch the coffin. She had to be cremated. Blood and post-mortem samples were taken from Dawn and sent for testing by the internationally accredited Defence Science and Technology Laboratory in Porton Down. Samples were also sent to the Organisation for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons for independent testing. Both organisations concluded that a specific Novichok nerve agent was present in Dawn's samples. A post-mortem by a leading forensic pathologist took place under so-called chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear conditions. It found that Dawn's death was caused by post-cardiac arrest, extensive and severe brain injury, and intracerebral hemorrhage caused by Novichok. Back on the 30th of June 2018, Charlie had also come into contact with the Novichok. When trying to connect the applicator to the Nina Ricci bottle, he spilled some of the substance on his hands. He washed it off straight away, however, with soap and water, and did not suffer symptoms immediately. After Dawn was taken away by ambulance, he was left stunned and did not know what to do. He had planned to go and visit her in hospital later, but during the afternoon, he too fell ill. He thinks he may have been recontaminated by touching something in 9 Muggleton Road later. His symptoms were very similar to Dawn's. He was drooling profusely, fitting, and had pinpoint pupils. He was taken to the same hospital as Dawn and admitted to the intensive care unit, but after receiving appropriate treatment for Novichok poisoning, his condition improved, and he was discharged on the 20th of July. He has, however, suffered long-term physical and mental injuries as a result of the Novichok poisoning, including problems with his vision, legs, balance, and memory. A range of samples were taken from Dawn and Charlie and from items related to their poisoning and were sent to DSTL and the OPCW. So you will hear that those organisations found that exactly the same specific type of Novichok, which had killed Dawn and poisoned Charlie, was present in the Nina Ricci perfume bottle. That same type of Novichok had been applied to the outside front door handle on the weekend of the 2nd to the 4th of March 2018 of the house that Sergei and Yulia Skripal owned at 47 Christie Miller Road in Salisbury. These were not only the same type of Novichok, but that there is evidence they were also from the same batch made at the same time. The labs confirmed that the very same Novichok had poisoned Sergei and Yulia Skripal and D.S. Bailey, and that same specific stayed during the weekend of the 2nd to the 4th of March 2018. This indicates that they're responsible for Dawn's death. Indeed, as will be seen, treading all the way from the Kremlin to 9 Muggleton Road, Amesbury. The Novichok leads back to the Skripals. In order to understand who was culpable for Dawn's death, it's necessary to examine the circumstances of the poisoning of the Skripals. The Skripals were found collapsed on a bench in the Malting, Salisbury, having fallen ill at around 3:30 p.m. on the 4th of March 2018. Their symptoms were very similar to those later suffered by Dawn and Charlie. They had pinpoint pupils and secretions. The Novichok caused them to be extremely ill, but luckily it was comparatively quickly suspected and treated. It appears that but for their prompt medical treatments, they would have died. The highest level of Novichok was found later on the outside front door handle of their house. When the Skripals left their house on Sunday, the 4th of March 2018, at about 1:30 p.m, they both touched that front door handle. Novichok is persistent and transferable, which means that the Skripals left traces of it on what they touched afterwards, like ripples around a stone thrown into a pond, which show the time and place that they were contaminated. It appears that the severity and timing of their symptoms may provide further support for the conclusion that they were exposed to Novichok at 1:30 p.m, when they touched their front door handle that day. D.S. Bailey was also poisoned by the same specific Novichok. He too touched the front door handle of 47 Christy Miller Road when he searched the property sometime after the Skripals had been found collapsed. Was the Novichok on the front door handle on the evening of Saturday, 3rd of March? This is one of the questions the family would like to explore. It appears that a number of items he touched later that night were uncontaminated and left no trace of it on the things that she touched afterwards. Arrived at Gatwick Airport in the afternoon of Friday, the 2nd of March 2018, travelling from Moscow. They checked into room 108 and stayed there until Sunday, the 4th of March, 2:30 p.m. and 4:30 p.m. This was right around 6 p.m. Yulia had just flown in from Moscow. Petrov and Bosherov then returned by train to London morning, and then they travelled again to Salisbury. They went to the vicinity of 47 Christy Miller Road for a third and a fourth time, between about 12:01 and 12:17, and the second time between about 1:23 p.m. and 1:41 p.m. Their first trip that day gave them the opportunity to apply the Novichok to the front door handle, and later flew back to Moscow. Of course, the family will want to explore whether the evidence given at the inquiry supports or undermines all of this. But taking a step back for a moment and assuming that you do find the following facts are proved. So, firstly, the scientific trace evidence proves that the same specific Novichok that poisoned the Skripals and on Sunday morning. Third, other facts that you find, sir, then there appears to be no credible explanation other than that Petrov and Bosherov put the Novichok on the Skripal front door handle and then returned to their hotel room where they left Novichok traces by those means. And that's because there are a range of other evidence which may support the conclusion that Petrov and Bosherov deposited the Novichok on the front door handle, intending to poison Mr. Skripal. As you've heard, on the 5th of September 2018, the Prime Minister told Parliament that the two men had been charged with conspiracy to murder Sergei Skripal, and that they were in fact agents of the Russian State Main Intelligence Directorate, the GRU. You've seen clips from the 13th of September 2018 interview that they gave to Russia Today, in which they claimed to have been in Salisbury for tourist reasons, and that they visited Salisbury Cathedral and Old Sarum. What they said in that interview was plainly false. There was nothing of touristic interest in the region of 47 Christy Miller Road, and the CCTV demonstrators visited the places they claimed to have gone to.
Sorry, demonstrates that they could not have visited, what, the cathedral?
So they gave several places where they claimed to have gone to, including Old Sarum.
I think they said they came...
Certainly, the question as to whether what they said in the interview was true or not is a key one to be explored. So why they went past that residential address at 47 Christy Miller Road no fewer than 4 times during the weekend.
Yeah.
And as will be seen later, they were also using full... The design and packaging of the Nina Ricci bottle may also be potentially significant, for 2 reasons. Firstly, a question arises of whether the bottle that Charlie found was the same as that which was used to deposit Novichok on the Skripal front door handle. To examine that question, the family would like to explore whether there was Novichok inside the plastic wrappers, and particularly that which held the applicator, and if so, whether that shows that the device must have been used previously. 2018, after the bottle had been used to apply Novichok to the front door handle. Secondly, the design of the bottle and packaging is another piece in the jigsaw that may be relevant to Russian state culpability. It appears to have been special to detect it. One of the men could be carrying it as a present for a girlfriend. Further, its long applicator appears to have been suitable for squirting the Novichok onto a front door handle, keeping the would-be assassin at a distance. So there was a third man involved in the operation, travelling under... It appears there's going to be evidence that Petrov and Bosharov met him on the Saturday, 3rd of March.
Or at least may have done, I think.
Or may have done. The family looked forward to exploring the open evidence about that, and that the true identities of the three men were not Petrov, Bosharov and Fedotov. And as Mr. O'Connor has said, there's going to be evidence that they were, in fact, Dr. Alexander Mishkin, Colonel Anatoly Chepiga and General Denis Sergeyev, respectively, and that all three of them were agents working for Unit 2, and Sergeyev knew Mr. Skripal personally or had some personal animus against him. They must have been acting for someone else. However, the Russian state and Mr. Putin evidently did have a motive to attack Mr. Skripal. As Mr. O'Connor has explained, Mr. Skripal was convicted of espionage while he was a senior GRU agent. It was said that he'd been working for the British intelligence services and had betrayed Russian agents in Britain and the USA. After about 6 years in detention, he was exchanged in a spy swap that Mr. Skripal continued to work for security or intelligence services in the UK and abroad, the land. That was an ominous description, given that the Russian state under Mr. Putin has a track record of assassination and the poisoning by Novichok of Alexei Navalny. Indeed, the GRU agents, or the alleged GRU agents who came to the UK to try to kill Mr. Skripal, had themselves been involved in previous attacks against Russian state opponents, including in the Czech Republic. That's evidence to show the Russian state's propensity. Interest in the Skripals since at least 2013. Senior Russian officials who were implicated in the Skripal poisoning, including Mr. Putin, have given obviously false accounts in denying responsibility for the poison, aiding the Skripal poisoning. The history and provenance of the Novichok also appears to point to the conclusion that the Russian state was responsible. Firstly, there was enough Novichok in that the only way this quantity and purity of Novichok could have been made and deployed is by a state actor. Further, there's said to be independent evidence that the Russian state had Novichok in 2018. The Russian state developed and produced Novichok as a chemical weapon that would not be detected by Western defences, and continued to do so even after this was prohibited by the Chemical Weapons Convention. As Sir Mark Sedwell explained in his letter, Russia has trained personnel from special units to deliver Novichok for assassination, including by applying it to door handles, ability and intent.
Well, it's a very striking assertion. Is there any evidence of assertion?
The letter itself was phrased as an assessment without evidence to support it, but we, of course, will invite the inquiry to, whether in open or closed, to take into account any evidence that supports it that it can.
Just so.
The inquiry has recently disclosed a witness statement by Jonathan Allen, which contains the UK government's current assessments as to who was responsible for the incident. He explains that it's the government's view that President Putin authorised the operation. That view is supported by cogent reasoning set out in Mr. Allen's witness statement, which Mr. O'Connor has touched upon, and by other evidence that's been recently disclosed. So, in light of that new evidence, the family invite you to call Mr. Putin as a witness to give oral evidence to the inquiry. As an individual who's now been identified through persuasive evidence as being responsible for the attempted murder of Mr. Skripal, and ultimately responsible for Dawn's death, he is clearly a relevant and important witness. He shouldn't cower behind the walls of the Kremlin. He should look into Dawn's family, he should look Dawn's family in the eyes and answer the evidence against him.
Well, that's an intriguing suggestion, Mr. Straw. Supposing you're right about it, I could, I suppose, issue an invitation. Have I any power whatever to enforce it?
No, I'm afraid not.
No. All right, well, I'll think about it.
Thank you. We would hope that Mr. Putin, if he was invited to attend, would have the bravery to face the evidence against him. But the chances of that being put into reality may well be very, very small.
They may.
In summary, the evidence taken together points in only one direction, we say. Mishkin and Chapiga were directly responsible for the attempted murder of Sergei Skripal by applying Novichok to the door handle of 47 Christie Miller Road shortly after midday on Sunday, the 4th of March 2018. The attack was orchestrated by the Russian state and authorised by Mr. Putin. So if you conclude that Mishkin and Chapiga had the Novichok in their possession in Salisbury at around lunchtime on the 4th of March 2018, and that Charlie subsequently found that very same Novichok, then it appears that it inevitably follows that the two men were criminally culpable for Dawn's death. Mishkin and Chapiga must have left the Novichok in a place where it would foreseeably cause harm in the short time before their departure.
Yeah.
There is no other credible explanation as to how exactly the same Novichok from the same batch, produced at the same time, was later picked up by Charlie in the Salisbury area. So far as the open evidence shows so far, or the open reporting, it's never been brought to the UK before or since. It's incredibly difficult and dangerous to produce and transport. It is simply fanciful that the Novichok which poisoned Dawn was brought to the UK by different people at a different time for a different unidentified purpose. Depositing the Novichok in central Salisbury, when that same Novichok later caused Dawn's death, was unlawful killing. It was either unlawful act or gross negligence manslaughter. As to unlawful act manslaughter, A, the killing was the result of an intentional act, namely depositing the Novichok. This was unlawful. For example, it was an offence under Section 2 of the Chemical Weapons Act, 1996. All sober and reasonable people would realise that that act carried a risk of harm to another person. That is, they would realise that leaving what appeared to be a genuine perfume bottle that contained enough Novichok to kill many thousands of people was a game of Russian roulette that put the UK public at grave risk. And finally, Dawn's death resulted from that act. The science makes clear that the Novichok that Mishkin and Chapiga left behind killed Dawn. As to gross negligence manslaughter, looking at each of the elements, and by depositing the Novichok, Mishkin and Chapiga created a very serious danger. That meant they assumed a duty of care to the class of people who foreseeably might happen to be in the general area of the danger which they had created. The duty was breached in a grossly negligent manner by leaving the Novichok where it may be recovered. At the time there was a breach, there was a serious and obvious risk of death, which was reasonably foreseeable due to leaving the weapon of mass destruction in public. And this breach caused Dawn's death. So we're only at the beginning of the inquiry, but out of fairness, we wanted to set out the case that we think the Russian state will need to meet during the inquiry.
Yes, thank you.
Given the nature of those legal tests and the compelling scientific and other evidence, it doesn't appear to be necessary to understand exactly how the Novichok went from the front door of 47 Christie Miller Road to the kitchen of 9 Muggleton Road. However, there are a number of potential options as to how the bottle may have found its way between the two places. Charlie's recollection, currently, is that he found it a few days before he gave it to Dawn in the bins in the Brown Street car park behind Cancer Research UK in central Salisbury. So Dawn's death is a tragedy for her family, her partner, and her friends. Living a quiet life in rural Salisbury, they were stunned to be the collateral damage of global spy wars. It felt like James Bond meets the Archers. But the consequences could have been even more disastrous. For example, a group of children could have found and opened the bottle and been killed. What would have happened if the Nina Ricci bottle had been taken into and used in a crowded local venue? It was capable of causing a massacre. So I'll hand over now to Mr. Mansfield.
Very well, thank you very much, Mr. Straw.
You want to go?
Probably.
Good afternoon, sir.
Yes, Mr. Mansfield, good to see you, thank you.
As you've gathered, we have divided it up, and it will continue in that way when we get to witnesses. So there's
By
no
all means, take your own course, Mr. Mansfield.
So the part that I'm dealing with is under the general heading of the indirect responsibility. That's obviously focusing on the United Kingdom And there are two aspects to the United Kingdom in this context. One is, can be coined by the phrase preventability, a phrase you've heard many times before. That's the first part of what I want to say, and on behalf of the family. And then the second half is concerned with the emergency responses, both to the Skripal or Salisbury attack, as well as the second one. And of course, there are clear ramifications that arise out of the first one that bear upon the second, and I'll get to those in a moment. So dealing with the question of preventability, we make a very clear submission here. We say there has been a failure, an abject failure, to protect not only the Skripals and the family, but particularly Mr. Skripal and his daughter, but also Dawn and Charlie, who you've heard about. But the bit that often gets missed in this equation is the wider public, because a focus, for obvious reasons, has been very much on the persons who were hit in the first place. However, we say there is an overriding necessity, if you're going to accommodate somebody like Sergei Skripal in a town or city such as Salisbury, you have to be concerned about a wider public. But of course, we say it goes well beyond Salisbury. As you know, Novichok was in fact found in London as well. So the ramifications, therefore, are very widespread. And as we've already argued, Dawn's death was, we say, directly caused by the Russian state. Clearly a question for you, but that is our contention. But the poisoning of Mr. Skripal was no bolt from the blue. For reasons we've addressed already today, he was a close and a clear and obvious target of an attack from Mr. Putin and his henchmen. As a former high-ranking military intelligence officer in the GRU, he was an important asset with high-level knowledge and intelligence. And you will see from his interviews, the original ones that he gave, of which we've been allowed to see, as I understand it, only part, he clearly regarded himself in that category with high-level knowledge and intelligence. His defection to the West as part of a prisoner exchange singled him out as a traitor to Mr. Putin's warped conception of the Russian motherland. May I just interpose, because you've heard it just this morning from Mr. O'Connor. It can hardly be considered that a swap of spies in the way that it occurred in 2010 was some form of exoneration by the Russian state for Mr. Skripal, let alone a pardon, which seems to be prayed in aid as to why no precautions were taken. His image of himself is not mere speculation. Yulia Skripal describes in her interviews that her father was considered like a traitor. And as we've set out, Mr. Putin has spoken of Mr. Skripal personally, referring to him as a traitor who had left the motherland and continued cooperating, consulting some special services. The risk to Mr. Skripal was plain. He was a marked man, identified by Mr. Putin as a turncoat for Western intelligence. Mr. Putin has spoken openly about the need to destroy and crush traitors. Mr. Skripal's friend, Mr. Cassidy, recalls Mr. Skripal telling him prior to the attack, although as you've heard, that is now being qualified to some extent by Mr. Skripal himself. However, prior to the attack, that Putin was out to get him. And Mr. Skripal himself considered that he would be at risk if he ever returned to Russia. There are other compelling reasons for thinking that Mr. Putin would make good on his stated desire to crush a perceived traitor, such as Mr. Skripal. First, Mr. Putin has spoken of Mr. Skripal personally, in public, and Mr. Skripal told his interviewers that he held significant information about Mr. Putin, including evidence of high-level embezzlement and corruption by the Russian president. This personal connection added a particular layer of animus towards Mr. Skripal that was well known in the United Kingdom and to the authorities, of course. Secondly, there is considerable evidence that Mr. Skripal undertook work with the United Kingdom and other Western intelligence and military agencies that was directly contrary to Russia's malign global interests, including exposing Russian agents, passing secret information abroad, and providing briefings on Russia to foreign intelligence agencies. Credible reporting indicates that Mr. Skripal was supplying evidence to the United Kingdom intelligence services in the period shortly before he was attacked. That's a period which comes well within the terms of reference as amended in terms of earlier in the year, 2018. Mr. Skripal himself stated in the aftermath of the attack that the Russian authorities believed he was still actively working for the West and that this was the number one reason. I paused there. This is how it was being put in the first interviews. There may now be some form of backtracking on what was said, but effectively, that's what he was saying. That's how he perceived it. Not suggesting it's the only perception, but that's how he perceived it. Had he raised his public profile, making him a greater target for Russian reprisal with the knowledge and approval of the United Kingdom authorities. There is a third reason, that the threat to Mr. Skripal was real and foreseeable leading up to early 2018. The Russian state had shown itself willing to carry out targeted assassinations of defection abroad, including, and you've already had mention of these, so I won't go through the detail, Litvinenko being one of them and Navalny being another one, but that was a bit earlier. Therefore, as Mr. Putin's direction seemed ghoulishly familiar after the Litvinenko because of the similarity between the two of using a poison. But in fact, this was no joining of the dots with the benefit of hindsight. The killing of Mr. Litvinenko showed well before the Salisbury attack that Mr. Putin was committed to eliminating, through chemical means, defectors deemed to have turned to Western intelligence. As Mr. Skripal himself said, following his attempted murder, Mr. Putin really likes poison. This is again in the interviews. This penchant for poison and Mr. Skripal's own status put him squarely in harm's way. The evidence suggests a risk to Mr. Skripal that was real, substantial, and foreseeable. As a result, did he or the United Kingdom authorities recognize the collateral risk posed to the community in which he resided? And were any precautionary measures for that community considered? These are central questions for this inquiry. Given Mr. Skripal was manifestly an obvious target, what was done to prevent the attack? That's the question of profound importance to Dawn's family, to her partner, to the emergency services, and to the wider public. The Novichok attack against Mr. Skripal caused Dawn's death, nearly killed her partner, placed first responders, one of which has been mentioned today, Police Sergeant Bailey, and the wider public in particular, in Salisbury, Amesbury, and London more widely, at very great risk. If the attack could and should have been prevented by the United Kingdom authorities, Dawn's family and partner are entitled to know. So are the wider public. Was there a failure to prevent a chemical weapon attack on the United Kingdom soil? Were countless members of the public, thousands in fact, put at risk, with the potential for hundreds or even thousands of deaths? These are questions of the greatest gravamen, to which the public deserve answers. Public confidence requires it. Furthermore, it is only by investigating this preventability issue fully, thoroughly, and fearlessly that wider learning can take place. This is vital, as the risk posed by the Russian state remains real and immediate. Now, I pause for a moment. We have indicated a reference to what happened last week. Namely, the head of MI5, Ken McCallum, made a public statement. And in it, so language redolent of the opening that we had already drafted, he cites particularly graphic language in relation to the organisation that is, we suggest, at the heart of this case. In other words, what he was telling the public was that we should expect to see continued acts of aggression here at home. He's talking about Russia. The GRU, in particular, is on a sustained mission to generate mayhem on British and European streets. We've seen arson, sabotage, and more dangerous actions conducted with increasing recklessness. Now, we say that's an interesting description because he's putting his finger on something that's been going on far longer than Ukraine or any of the other threats that are looming in the background. So we say that supports the suggestion that the GRU would be playing a very active part, and of course, Mr. Skripal had been in the GRU at a senior position. Does Mr. Skripal's case indicate that too little is done by the United Kingdom intelligence agencies to ensure the prosecution of former Russian intelligence officers who have settled in the United Kingdom? This is an issue that the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament raised in July 2020. So again, a suitable distance from now, but obviously in relation to, no doubt that was one of the concerns arising out of this case. Does the United Kingdom have the necessary capabilities to place properly to identify the threat of Russian attacks on the United Kingdom and so prevent them? This directly impacts the safety of United Kingdom citizens and the paramount duty of the state. And we say, in relation to this inquiry, the importance of open, as far as is possible, open and public revelations about what has gone wrong in this case. In order to investigate the preventability issue fully, thoroughly, fearlessly, a number of central issues and questions require scrupulous examination. And as we go along, I would ask if you'd very kindly consider the extent to which many of these can be asked in public and can be answered in public. Did the United Kingdom authorities recognize the need for a dynamic risk assessment of the threat posed to Mr. Skripal from the Russian state? Now, again, I'm going to pause there to give an example. For example, in the inquiry, we're not going to undermine the NCND policy or protocol or what a practice, however it's determined, by the public knowing that there was a threat assessment, or more likely, there wasn't one. Because it's the negative that is important in this case. And this isn't a case of, therefore, revealing something sophisticated and intricate. We say there doesn't seem to be one. How was that risk assessment carried out, and by whom? Did it recognise the real and substantial risk that Mr. Skripal faced? If not, why not? Have changes been made in risk identification and assessment since the Salisbury attack? Have they been effective? Are more needed? None of these questions are addressed, let alone answered, in the evidence before the family. Mr. Skripal's recent statement takes the position no further. He says he wasn't aware of any risk assessment about the threat he faced. May I just pause again? It's a bit difficult for a risk assessment if, in fact, the person concerned is not made aware of or at least asked for the purposes of a risk assessment, what are your considerations? It doesn't appear that that happened, and was not even aware who was responsible for his security in the United Kingdom. This simply emphasises the central issue that requires investigation and begs a range of crucial questions. What was done to identify the risk to the wider community and ensure the protection of the public? There's no evidence that anything was done. What was done to protect Mr. Skripal given the serious risk he faced? The family have raised these questions, the family who I represent, throughout the lengthy life of this inquiry. And may I say, and I think you have paid tribute to the fact, it's taken a time, but they have been extraordinarily patient in order for these questions to be asked and answered. Yet there is no evidence before the family and the wider public that any protective measures were put in place. Mr. Skripal suggests he was offered a change of name, but was never told this was needed, and CCT was recommended, but he declined. That is the extent of the evidence before the family and the public on the protection considered by the United Kingdom authorities for a senior Russian spy personally identified as a traitor by President Putin. Crucially, that is the extent of the evidence on what was done to protect the public from a clear and obvious risk. And I summarise the position. Essentially what we have is Mr. Skripal saying, I don't want any of it. I decline. I don't want another name. I don't want this. Is it to be said in future, therefore, that somebody on an exchange can effectively dictate the security of the United Kingdom by saying, I don't want any of this? So these are questions, we say, another example of questions that can be asked in public. It is appreciated that Mr. Skripal is not going to be called, but there are plenty of other people who've obviously had the responsibility, whether they've exercised that, will hopefully find out in public. As a result, Mr. Skripal, a known double agent and target of the President of Russia, was living openly with his family in the United Kingdom, all under his own name, in a Salisbury cul-de-sac. Why? Why was he not given a different identity at an unknown and varied location? None of this, we say, is unreasonable or disproportionate or inappropriate. We say all these measures are appropriate. It appears that he'd been subject to no change of appearance, so was easily identifiable to would-be attackers. These measures could and should have been made a condition of Mr. Skripal's United Kingdom residence from the beginning to ensure public protection. Appreciated. It can't be utterly foolproof, but you have to make a start somewhere. There seems to have been no start anywhere. Mr. Skripal's address was alarmingly accessible to the GRU's assassins. Why was he not accommodated in a gated estate, or at least within an apartment block requiring an entry code and appropriate security? Again, we ask, are these unreasonable questions? Are they unreasonable measures? We say not at all. There is no evidence that his property was equipped with, and he admitted this in this first set of interviews, was sensor cameras, CCTV. What is being said this morning by Mr. O'Connor as reading the interviews, that he didn't want to make himself conspicuous. I mean, he's living under his own name. Well, we say none of this makes sense for the authorities to have allowed this to develop in the way that it did. These are the most basic of protective measures. In their absence, GRU agents simply walked up to his front door, applied a deadly nerve agent to the handle, that is our submission, and left. The most rudimentary home security monitoring would have identified them. It is notable that the Scripples are not being called to give evidence in this inquiry, primarily, and as Mr. O'Connor said, essentially this was the core reason of your ruling, and I don't dispute it for one moment, because the risk is too great that their identities and locations could be discoverable. A risk said to be the same as the attack in Salisbury. If so, why was a similar precautionary approach not adopted by the authorities in the way that you have? There is no evidence that steps were taken to mitigate the threats to Mr. Skripal emanating from Russia. Why does nothing appear to have been done to scrutinise visa applications for known false names? As you've heard this morning, these individuals have been travelling around quite a lot under these false names, which had been used before by GRU, and inconsistencies in the visa applications used by Mr. Putin's GRU assassins. Were communications and movements by these individuals monitored since they were known? And their other websites were broadcasting their movements before it was announced who else was involved. Were communications and movements by these individuals monitored? Were their communications by the Skripals also monitored to ascertain Russian interference or interest? Why were red flag alerts not in place in the UK at UK border control to monitor arrival, instigate inquiries, bag searches? Why was nothing done to ensure local police and emergency services were informed of Mr. Skripal's presence in their jurisdiction? A question coming up, no doubt, this week with witnesses.
Is it going to be part of your case, Mr. Mansfield, that the UK authorities were aware of the identities of these people? And it's,
I'm not in a position to know, because it's neither confirm or deny.
You've just asserted it, as I understand it.
Well, the position is, we don't know from them, but we know from the website Bellingcat that they were known.
I see. All right. Thank you.
And if I may say so, if that is a very sensitive area for government and for the security services to indicate they did know, if they did know, the situation is compounded. We say it was pretty obvious if a site that's well known to them had already actually tracked through metadata where they were and who they were, and the use of these false names.
Right.
It would have led, even if they didn't know the real identities, that there was something rather peculiar about these applications. There is no evidence that steps were taken to mitigate the threats to Mr. Skripal's I've read this bit, in the visa applications. Sorry, give me 1 second.
No, my fault, Mr.
Yeah, I've indicated red flags should have been up, and the local police forces and emergency services, and as we understand it, nobody was informed. Again, we might be told, none of the local police forces were told that Mr. Skripal or somebody like him, even if they didn't want to give his name, was residing in a part of Salisbury City. Presently, there's no plausible explanation from any quarter about the absence of precautions to protect Mr. Skripal and the wider community. It cannot be rationally argued that such an explanation is a state secret, and that the public are not entitled to know how such a blatant omission has arisen. Now, I pause again. Mr. O'Connor this morning said, very early on in his narrative to you, that he raised the possibility, it was a sort of hinted observation, that possibly mistakes may have led and contributed. Now, I don't know what mistakes he means, but I can guess. I hope I'm not being unreasonable in inferring that what he was meaning was here, that those who did have responsibility have made mistakes. We say, if that's true, they're gargantuan ones. And we, as the public, and of course the family in particular, need to know how such mistakes of such size, given the obvious measures that we've talked about, utterly appropriate were not done. It may be said that in the absence of open evidence of protective measures, but these are matters for the closed hearings, the family's response is threefold. Firstly, the issues that I've just been going through appear capable of open investigation, and I've made suggestions as the ones that are not going to endanger national security, but in fact should enhance it, with appropriate calibration if required. The absence of any open evidence indicating that effective risk assessment and protection took place suggests there were no such assessments or protections. Secondly, if there is closed evidence on these issues, it is nonetheless clear that Mr. Skripal was living in the open, in his own name, with no security monitoring at his home. That is a seriously deficient arrangement, whatever the closed evidence may contain. Thirdly, that seriously deficient arrangement exposed Mr. Skripal and his daughter to a risk of death, tragically avoidable. Dawn, however, died. I pass to the second. I'm watching the time closely because you said just before. Oh, yes. I'm not going to just before the fall, but I have a little more to say. The second area or aspect of what we would submit to you is the response to the Skripal poisoning. In other words, the emergency responses to both, in fact. The response to, and we do this merely to indicate, and I'll put it generally to make it easier to understand, the family have accepted that the survivability, another issue, is one they don't wish to contest publicly. So I'm not going to take up time on that, but they are anxious that the inquiry, in fact, grapple with one or two issues that remain in relation to how such events as this are going to be handled in the future. So it's concerned with the future provision and recommendations, and in particular, the aspect of how the police handle this matter. The response to the poisoning of the Skripals compromised a number of strands: investigation, public health information and messaging, community engagement, reassurance, scientific advice and research, local and central government decision-making, and decontamination. The inquiry has obtained and disclosed a number of documents bearing on these various responses to the Salisbury attack. Those documents paint a picture of some concern. They describe organizational disputes and disagreements over tactical and strategic decision-making, and a lack of clarity on how to secure essential scientific advice. There are references to public health officials being risk-averse and too slow to offer advice and make decisions. The question of public advice on the dry cleaning of potentially contaminated clothing took up considerable time, including at a national level. The documents contain concerns expressed by public health bodies that secrecy, withholding of relevant information, and an over-centralization of decision-making in central government hampered the response. One report, prepared in the aftermath of the Skripal attack, states that in the early stages of the response, it was very difficult to get credible information to support decision-making. The report records that the most comprehensive source of information to local police was Wikipedia. Another debrief following the events in Salisbury notes that nothing had been learned from the Litvinenko case. And this section is particularly geared to lessons for the future. No doubt the inquiry will wish to explore these and other response issues during the hearings with witnesses and by reference to the documents that have been obtained. However, the family consider that there are two central questions in this area that merit thorough examination. Were adequate steps taken to identify the risk of discarded Novichok and locate it? That's a question that will come up this week. And were effective measures taken to ensure that first responders, including healthcare professionals and the police, were aware of Novichok symptoms and the essential treatment steps in response, particularly with regard to the possibilities of wider contamination in the community. Were adequate steps taken to identify the risk of discarded Novichok and locate it? The risk that Novichok potentially, in significant quantity, remained in the United Kingdom was an obvious and real one. The nerve agent must have been transported into the United Kingdom in some form of container. There are reasons why Mr. Putin's GRU assassins, as we put it, would not wish to take a container after use back through the UK border control and are likely, therefore, to have discarded it. These reasons are self-evident: to avoid self-contamination and death, to avoid detection. The United Kingdom authorities did consider the possibility that Novichok remained in the United Kingdom and the need to take steps to locate it in the interests of public safety. Detective Superintendent Murphy indicated in his initial statement that identifying whether any Novichok remained anywhere in the United Kingdom was a key priority to ensure public safety. In a meeting of the Special Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies on the 10th of July, a key date here, 2018, shortly after Dawn's death, DS Murphy says this, noted that immediately after the Skripals had been taken ill, police had looked at the potential entry and egress routes to their property and attempted to identify the most likely places where the remainder of the Novichok could have been disposed. In the minutes of the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies on the 9th of March, a priority public health risk that needed to be addressed by the police and others was where the substance has been deliberately placed but as yet undiscovered. May I pause again, because this is important for first responders, because if in fact you will recall in many of their statements they still think it's extremely rare, and that governs their approach to how they dealt with Dawn. Rarity wasn't the issue, because in fact the police were already considering, quite rightly, but were not warning the medical authorities. Otherwise, those attending would have thought, well, there could be more left, and they don't seem to be considering this dimension at all. Similarly, in emails within the Department for Health and Social Care on the 15th of March, it was recognised there was an outstanding risk of a secondary incident, including through the accidental discovery of discarded agent by humans. In emails on the 19th of March, Chris Whitty identifies the need to identify where the chemical might be as an investigation question, and in a debrief interview after the Salisbury attack, an anonymised responder states the possibility was considered that other caches of the agent could be present. Example being in a discarded bottle. A senior scientific advisor for the chemical and biological matters at the DTSL immediately after Amesbury event was able to envisage the nature and the size of any small bottle plus applicator before such were actually found. What was done to address this identified risk? A Wiltshire police officer search advisor was consulted, and later a National Police search advisor was enlisted to assist the investigation. 3 hypotheses were identified for where the suspects may have discarded any Novichok. The immediate vicinity of the attack site, at the points the offenders were out of line of sight of the house, and at points where the offenders could have changed their mode of transport, such as a cross-section between footpaths and roads. DS Murphy states that based on this assessment, wider searches were conducted in areas near to Mr. Skripal's home address that fitted these hypotheses. These searches only took place at the end of March, and drains within the home search area were not searched until the mid-April. Was this a sufficiently prompt response? No discarded Novichok was found in the police searches. Given that nothing was found, were the steps taken adequate? The police were aware from CCTV that by the time Bashirov and Petrov walked away from the Salisbury town centre, their small rucksack had moved from Bashirov to Petrov, and there's CCTV of this matter. Could this have indicated that Novichok contained in the rucksack had been removed and discarded in the town centre? Should more have been done to search for discarded Novichok, given the CCTV, and given that earlier searches had found nothing? Importantly, should all emergency services, especially medical responders, have been warned that despite the rarity, there was a real possibility that more undetected Novichok might be found? These are issues that the family invite the inquiry to explore carefully. And again, you will recall there are examples of Novichok being found in the toilet area of the park, and that may be relevant as to whether the Novichok bottle was sealed up there. Though we just pose it as a question that needs to be asked. Turning then to the second question identified, were effective measures taken to ensure the first responders, including paramedics, hospital staff and the police, were aware of Novichok symptoms and essential treatment steps in response? This was imperative given the identified risk that Novichok may have been discarded and at large in the community. As early as the 15th of March, the DHSC indicated that learning from the Salisbury attack should be rapidly disseminated to ensure effective and safe first response in future. On the same date, the DHSC recognised the need to respond to the question, what knowledge and training do hospital staff and other healthcare professionals have? The steps taken to equip first responders with key information on symptoms and treatment appear to be limited. Now, I've cited, and I'm not going to take time given the time that's already gone, in the paragraphs that follow, we've cited on the 9th of March, 10th of March, and in May, various documents which indicate would have helped with the discernment of symptoms and signs and what I call generally the features of Novichok poisoning, as opposed to getting it confused with opiates and so on. By the time of Dawn's poisoning, almost 4 months after the Salisbury attack, it appears that not enough had been done to ensure rapid identification and treatment of nerve agent poisoning in future cases. Even though more Novichok had been discovered in London in May, it has to be remembered that however rare the Amesbury event was, it did take place not far from Salisbury. Many of the medics were involved in both incidents, and it was the same hospital for all victims. Dr. Cockcroft, one of the ICU consultants who treated the Skripals, expresses his concern about the lost opportunity following the Skripal attack. He states he was forbidden to discuss any aspect of the presentation, recognition, or initial treatment of the Skripals, so important practice was not shared. I then cite a number of other documents. I'm not going to go through those given the time. So may I turn to the emergency response to Dawn's poisoning. The family have carefully considered the reports of Dr. Saw, Professor Nolan quite recently. They recognise their conclusion that Dawn's poisoning was unsurvivable and that differences in the emergency response would not have saved Dawn's life. The responsibility for that lies with the Russian state and Mr. Putin. But this inquiry represents an important opportunity to scrutinise the emergency response to Dawn's collapse, to identify any deficiencies, if there were such, and to learn from them for the future. There are compelling reasons to do that. Firstly, because the family are eager to ensure that Dawn's death was not in vain. If constructive improvements can flow from the inquiry into her death, they should be. Secondly, strong public interest in exposing any failings in the emergency response. Hundreds, if not thousands, of people were exposed to a grave risk that was left behind by Dawn's killers. If the response to Dawn's poisoning was inadequate, that could have affected countless members of the public and could do so in the future. Such inadequacy should be aired and exposed in public. Thirdly, sadly, attacks such as this are likely to happen again, and I've just cited the speech from last week. The past provides a warning to that effect. Such attacks will, by their nature, be unusual occurrences, deploying unexpected chemicals to kill and maim. But the fact that such incidents will be rare and unusual is the very reason why the police and healthcare professionals must be prepared to respond effectively and take a precautionary approach. That's essential to save lives in future. And this inquiry has an opportunity to aid that preparation. It is an opportunity that should not be squandered. Dawn and her family and the wider public are entitled to that. What then are the principal issues of concern in the emergency response to Dawn's case that should be subject to rigorous scrutiny? In respect of the paramedic response, it appears the staff were not adequately trained and equipped to identify that Dawn's symptoms were wholly consistent with nerve agent poisoning. Dawn exhibited numerous symptoms. I'm not going through them, they're well known and they're set out there. Importantly, there was no evidence of an opioid overdose. Dawn had no history of opioid misuse. Her records did not show that she was an illicit drug user, and the responding paramedics were told by her partner at the scene she didn't take drugs. Taken with her symptoms and the proximity in time and location to the Skripal poisoning in March, it is a concern that the nerve agent or organophosphate poisoning was not suspected. That concern is augmented by the rapid recognition and treatment of nerve agent poisoning in her partner's case, Charlie, just a few hours later. The assessment of Charlie Rowley's collapse in the evening of the 30th of June gives rise to a further concern. The police response, faced with multiple paramedics identifying Charlie's symptoms as consistent with nerve agent poisoning, numerous police officers rejected the paramedics' assessment in favour of a drug overdose. They were wrong to do so, as Wiltshire Police now accept. The police decided that Dawn and Charlie's condition was a quite straightforward overdose on the basis that these are two well-known drug addicts, and this was false. Dawn was not a well-known drug addict. There was no intelligence that Dawn was a drug user. Dawn had no previous convictions, cautions, or reprimands for drug use or for any other offences. The 9 Muggleton Road property wasn't hers, and searches of Dawn's property found nothing indicating that she was a drug addict, which she wasn't. She was not. Wiltshire Police have now accepted that Dawn should not have been characterised in this way, and it was an error that she was. Wiltshire Police have apologised, and may I say on behalf of the family, they're grateful for the apology, late though it may be, better than not at all. And it is important because it had an effect on doctors who were treating Dawn at the time, and of course the public image, which has taken quite a lot to live down and they had to live with. And we say the ramifications of what the police approach, not all of them, but some of them, overriding what the medics were saying, overriding information, and actually misconstruing guilt by association, which I'm afraid is a not uncommon approach in some police quarters. I don't read the rest of it. It is concerned with the same point being made. So may I turn to the end? I'm not going to apologise for taking too long because these are very important matters. The outstanding and closed evidence. This opening statement has been prepared at a time when highly material evidence remains outstanding. In particular, the statements of the Skripals do not address crucial questions put by the family concerning preventability. Mr. Skripal suggests he didn't think he was in danger despite being a risk, and he says he declined limited protection offered. But the key question for the family and the wider public, why did the United Kingdom authorities fail to identify the risk he faced? How was it that no protection was put in place? These are central questions that are pressing and reveal a shocking indifference to public safety, which we've tried to emphasise over and above the safety of Dawn herself. Dawn has the chair has made, you have made rightly clear that you'll make public as much of the evidence as is possible without harming national security. And we would plainly would endorse that. However, we do suggest in this particular area and areas related to the medical approach as well, that the balance between an open hearing in which the public can find reassurance, where you can allay rumour, the public, especially the British public, the United Kingdom public, deserve to know that not just that you're assured of what you see, but that they can be assured on the back of what it is you've seen. So those are the submissions that I make. I'd ask that the bits I haven't read out you might read in the quiet of the evening. Thank you.
Yes, I shall look forward to it, Mr. Mansfield. Indeed, I've seen them before. Thank you very much. I gather it would be convenient if we were to break now 10 to 4, please. Yes. Miss McGackie, are you next? All right. Yes, Miss Vanette. No, that's perfectly all right. I just didn't know.
So, as you know, sir, both the Commissioner of Police of the Metropolis and the Chief Constable of Thames Valley Police are core participants in this inquiry, and this opening statement is made jointly on their behalf.
Yep.
The two police forces, through the Counter-Terrorism Command known as SO15, and through Counter-Terrorism Policing South East, established Operation Verbasco, which is their combined response to this inquiry into the death of Dawn Sturgess, on behalf of the Counter-Terrorism Policing Network more generally, which, while I'm going to try and avoid acronyms, I'll refer to as CTP, if I may.
All right.
So may I start by reiterating the sincere condolences of both forces and all the officers involved to the family of Dawn Sturgess. CTP is determined to bring to justice those responsible for her death. There are three areas that we would like to address briefly in this opening statement. They are Operation Verbasco's participation in the inquiry to date, a route map to the oral evidence which Operation Verbasco's witnesses will give to the inquiry in open hearings, and thirdly, an overview of the criminal case against the suspects. So, starting with Operation Verbasco's assistance to the inquiry, as you know, sir, Operation Verbasco was initially established to assist the inquest into the death of Dawn Sturgess, chaired by Baroness Hallett. Since the announcement of this inquiry on the 18th of November 2021, it's been expanded to more than 40 officers, and members of the Verbasco team have worked closely with your legal team and with other core participants to progress towards these hearings. Sir, the scale of the investigation into the poisonings in Salisbury and Amesbury is difficult to overstate, involving cooperation between police and partners across government and extensive inquiries both in the UK and internationally. It follows that documentary disclosure has been a particularly complex and time-consuming task. Adopting an appropriately low threshold of potential relevance, Operation Verbasco identified several thousand documents which it collated and provided to the inquiry, and the inquiry in turn has reviewed those documents with care in order to identify the material that it should consider in accordance with its terms of reference. It's not been possible, of course, for all the material identified as relevant by the inquiry to be disclosed into open proceedings for the reasons already touched upon. In short, some of that material contains sensitive information which would be of value to those who threaten UK national security and continue to pose a danger to the public. Operation Verbasco has worked closely with its police and government partners to support the inquiry in giving effect to its commitment to disclose as much relevant material into open proceedings as possible. CTP recognises the profound importance of open justice and will continue to support the inquiry in facilitating the effective engagement of the family in these proceedings. As matters stand, the inquiry has disclosed to all core participants almost 800 documents from Operation Verbasco, and this has been the product of painstaking work by all concerned in accordance with the protocols you have established to ensure the maximum open disclosure of material that is consistent with the protection of national security imperatives and other important public interests. As the inquiry proceeds, Operation Verbasco will continue to work with policing and other partners across government to give effect to your rulings on what can be made open and what must remain closed. In addition to the extensive disclosure exercise, the Verbasco team produced an open document explaining the conclusions of the linked investigations into the 2018 Salisbury and Amesbury poisonings. That document, which I'll refer to as the report, has been produced through an iterative process in preparation for these hearings, with the inquiry legal team providing feedback on CTP's progress and with helpful input from the family in later stages. The report's accompanied by a detailed graphics pack, which we've seen some of this morning, and which, among other things, provides a detailed analysis of phone data and CCTV footage obtained during the criminal investigations, and which helps to explain what happened and when. The teams worked closely with the inquiry legal team to produce a number of video compilations tracing the events with which this inquiry is concerned, and we hope that these videos, which have been disclosed to the other core participants, will be of real value. CTP remains fully committed to assisting the inquiry as it progresses. Moving on to the second area that we'd like to cover, and that's the oral evidence which Operation Verbasco's witnesses will give in open. So CTP's work in relation to the events with which this inquiry is concerned has taken place under 3 overarching operations. The first is Operation Wadana, the overt reactive investigation dealing with events on the ground following the attack on Sergei and Yulia Skripal in Salisbury in March 2018. The Senior Investigating Officer, or SIO, in 2018 was a detective superintendent whose name is protected by a restriction order and who's being referred to as VN012. Secondly, there was Operation Reed, the overt investigation into the poisoning of Dawn Sturgess and Charlie Rowley in June 2018. And the SIO in 2018 was Detective Chief Inspector Philip Murphy. Thirdly, Operation Caterva is the investigation into those responsible for the poisonings in Salisbury and Amesbury in 2018. It was established as a covert investigation, becoming an overt investigation in September 2018. The SIO is Commander Dominic Murphy, who was a detective superintendent in SO15 at the time of his appointment. Operation Caterva was and remains responsible for liaising with the Crown Prosecution Service regarding charges arising out of the 3 operations. The inquiry will be hearing from CTP witnesses with direct and detailed knowledge of all 3 of those operations. The first CTP witness due to give evidence, that is Commander Dominic Murphy. During the first week, Commander Murphy will introduce the report and accompanying documents, and he'll then return to give evidence at various points during the proceedings. His evidence will address matters including, firstly, the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal in Salisbury in March 2018. Secondly, the CTP response to those poisonings. Thirdly, Charlie Rowley's possession of the bottle containing Novichok. Fourthly, the movements of Dawn Sturgess and Charlie Rowley on the 29th and 30th of June 2024. And it will also cover the investigation and identification of the suspects. It's also anticipated that you'll hear from Detective Chief Inspector Philip Murphy, whose evidence will focus on Operation Reed. He will explain the circumstances and events surrounding the poisoning of Dawn Sturgess and Charlie Rowley and provide detail of the investigation he led into those events. The third witness will be Keith Asman. In 2018, he was the head of forensics and digital investigation within Counter-Terrorism Policing South East. He'll explain to the inquiry how the search for the Novichok developed from March 2018 onwards, including the extensive sampling operation that was conducted. He'll describe the searches in Salisbury carried out by a forensic management team and explain the forensic search strategies produced by that team in collaboration with the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory, DSTL. Mr. Asman's evidence will also cover the forensic investigations that took place in both Salisbury and Amesbury as part of Operation Reed, which again involved an extensive searching and sampling operation. I've already referred to the open-closed divide, sir. That has, of course, been the subject of a number of detailed rulings, and it's something to which the witnesses will have to give careful thought when giving their oral evidence. It's very likely that topics will arise in respect of which the witness might wish to give a fuller explanation or a more detailed explanation, but is unable to do so in open session because of the need to protect the public. We know that your team will be paying close attention to these matters and that they'll inform the questions that the witness is given an opportunity to address in closed. Could I then move on to an overview and update on the criminal case? To date, the investigations into the poisonings in Salisbury and Amesbury in 2018 have resulted in charges against 3 suspects, all Russian nationals linked to Russia's military intelligence agency known as the GRU. CTP concluded that these suspects came to the UK to kill Sturgess, and while they did not succeed in that aim, their actions had devastating consequences, and in particular, they brought about the death of Dawn Sturgess. CTP assesses the names of those individuals to be Anatoly Shupiga, Alexander Mishkin, and Denis Sergeyev. While in the UK in March 2018, they used the aliases Ruslan Boshirov, Alexander Petrov, and Sergei Fedotov, respectively. And I'll refer to them by those aliases in the remainder of this opening statement. On the 19th of July 2018, the Crown Prosecution Service authorised charges against Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Boshirov for conspiracy to murder Sergei Skripal. 3 counts of attempted murder in respect of Sergei and Yulia Skripal and Nick Bailey, 2 counts of grievous bodily harm with intent in respect of Yulia Skripal and Nick Bailey, and 1 count of use or possession of a chemical weapon. Those charges were publicly announced on the 5th of September 2018. On the 20th of April 2021, the Crown Prosecution Service authorised charges against Sergei Fedotov for the same offences, and this was announced on the 21st of September 2021. For the reasons outlined in the report, CTP considers that these 3 individuals are responsible, as a result of their actions in March 2018, for the subsequent death of Dawn Sturgess and the poisoning of her partner, Charlie Rowley. CTP will continue to work closely with partners, including the Crown Prosecution Service, to hold these individuals accountable for their actions. While Russia refuses to extradite its own citizens, it does remain possible that 1 or more of the suspects may be brought to justice in future, either because they've entered the UK or because they've been apprehended by another country pursuant to the red notices that have been issued against all 3 individuals through Interpol. CTP remains committed to do everything in its power to bring about the prosecution of the suspects. And in the event that such a prosecution becomes feasible, CTP will stand ready to provide its full support to the Crown Prosecution Service to enable criminal proceedings to move forward. In conclusion, sir, Operation Verbasco welcomes the commencement of the open hearings and is committed to continue its cooperation with this inquiry. CTP as a whole continues to work to bring to justice those responsible for the death of Dawn Sturgess.
Thank you, Ms. Giovanetti.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, Mr. Gaggi.
Sir, I represent His Majesty's government. The government believes that Ms. Sturgess was the innocent and unintended victim of a cruel, deliberate and reckless attack on Sergei Skripal, an attack in which, as you've heard, he and his daughter Yulia were seriously injured. As again, you've already heard, it is the government's view that this attack was undertaken by agents of the Russian state, specifically by members of the Russian military intelligence unit, the GRU, and it's also the government's view that this operation was authorised by President Putin. The government's attribution of Russian responsibility for the operation which targeted Mr. Skripal and led directly to Ms. Sturgess's death is not made lightly. Instead, it is the product of a painstaking and thorough investigation into the circumstances of Ms. Sturgess's death and into the earlier attack on the Skripals. Immediately after the attack, the government maintained an open mind as to who was responsible. As the then Foreign Secretary, the Right Honourable Boris Johnson, observed in Parliament on Tuesday the 2nd of March 2018, which was 2 days after Mr. Skripal fell ill, it's too early to speculate about the precise nature of the crime or attempted crime that took place in Salisbury, but members will have their suspicions. Those suspicions, of course, quite naturally derived from, among other things, the fact that Mr. Skripal was a former Russian intelligence officer who was living in the UK following his release from prison in 2010, the use of Novichok, and the fact that this was a sophisticated chemical weapon known to have been developed by the Soviet Union. And those suspicions were, in the government's view, confirmed very shortly indeed. And within a week, it's on the 12th of March 2018, the evidence led the then Prime Minister, now Baroness May Maidenhead, to make the statement in Parliament, part of which you've heard played this morning.
Yeah.
After the extract that was played publicly today, the Prime Minister continued, "Mr. Speaker, there are therefore only two plausible explanations for what happened in Salisbury on the 4th of March. Either this was a direct attack by the Russian state against our country, or the Russian government lost control of this potentially catastrophically damaging nerve agent and allowed it to get into the hands of others." And after that, the extensive investigations continued, and a month later, on the 13th of April 2018, the then National Security Advisor, Sir Mark Sedwill, wrote to the NATO Secretary-General in the letter that you've already heard described. And he said, "Yesterday, the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons published their report summarising the analysis of environmental and biomedical samples relating to the investigation into the attempted assassination of Mr. Skripal and his daughter. The OPCW's analysis matches the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory's own, confirming once again the findings of the United Kingdom relating to the identity of the toxic chemical of high purity that was used in Salisbury. OPCW have always been clear that it was their role to identify what substance was used, not who was responsible." But turning to that question of responsibility, in that letter, Sir Mark Sedwill went on to identify 3 reasons why the government had concluded that Russia was responsible. First, the technical means and the use of Novichok, a chemical weapon developed by the former Soviet Union and subsequently inherited and developed by the Russian Federation. Secondly, Russia's proven record of conducting state-sponsored assassination, including, for example, against Alexander Litvinenko. And thirdly, the target, Mr. Skripal, a former Russian military intelligence officer. And as Sir Mark explained, we therefore continue to judge that only Russia has the technical means, operational experience and motive for the attack on the Skripals, and that it is highly likely that the Russian state was responsible. There is no plausible alternative explanation. As you've heard this morning, sir, you will hear evidence from a current senior official in His Majesty's government, Mr. Jonathan Allen, who's a Director General within the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office.
Yeah.
He will give evidence that the ongoing investigations since April 2018 have served only to strengthen the government's confidence in attributing this attack to Russia. And, as your counsel has already said, it is now the government's considered view that President Putin authorised this operation. Of course, whether the government's conclusion that Russia was responsible for these events is correct is a matter for you and a matter that this inquiry will investigate. Whether more could have been done to prevent the death of Ms Sturgess is also another matter for this inquiry to decide. The government understands fully the importance of the investigation into preventability, both in terms of what was done to protect Sergei Skripal and what was done to find any discarded Novichok before it caused the death of Ms Sturgess. These are matters which the government knows this inquiry will consider with immense thoroughness. But the government respectfully endorses the submission of counsel to the inquiry this morning that much of this evidence will have to be heard in closed session for the protection of others now and in the future. Sir, you have scrutinised with great care all applications to keep evidence enclosed, and you've required cogent justification for every application that's been made. The government recognises the need for as much transparency as possible in this inquiry, and it has taken great care itself to make applications for evidence to be closed only when that is truly necessary. There is a substantial body of material that will be considered in conditions that both protect national security and the lives of others. This is an inevitable part of the process in an inquiry of this sensitivity. Lastly, may I address the issue of hindsight? Hindsight is an essential part of any inquiry. It's only by looking back that one can ever seek to learn lessons for the future. But in my submission, hindsight should not unduly colour the inquiry's assessments of what could or should have been done by those who had to make decisions before the attack on the Skripals took place and before the tragic death of Ms Sturgess. The government has done, and the government will continue to do, everything it can to assist this inquiry and to help the family to have as many answers as it can. Sir.
Thank you very much.
Sir, I appear with Mr Berry for the Chief Constable of Wiltshire Police.
Yes, Mr Beggs.
As the inquiry will hear, the poisonings of Dawn Sturgess, Charlie Rowley, Sergei and Yulia Skripal, Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey and Police Constable Ollie Bell all occurred within the Wiltshire Police area for which the Chief Constable is responsible. On behalf of the Chief Constable, I too begin by repeating Wiltshire Police's sincere condolences to Dawn Sturgess' family and friends for their terrible loss. This inquiry is going to hear evidence about two incidents, the first in Salisbury and the second in Amesbury, that prompted police operations of very significant scale and complexity for a small constabulary such as Wiltshire. The initial response to both incidents was conducted by Wiltshire Police. The investigations were swiftly handed over to counter-terrorist police officers from Thames Valley, assisted by the Metropolitan Police. Alongside those criminal investigations, the consequence management was led by Wiltshire Police in partnership with other members of the Wiltshire Police Local Resilience Forum and national partners. This inquiry will hear evidence about Wiltshire police officers getting it right and sometimes getting it wrong. Wiltshire Police has engaged in a full debrief facilitated by the College of Policing to capture the learning from both incidents. Learning recommendations from that process have already been put in place. However, the Chief Constable is naturally keen to engage with any further learning identified by this inquiry so that her force and policing generally is best prepared to respond to a similar event in the future. And the Chief Constable remains committed to giving this inquiry her force's fullest assistance, as this team have been doing from the outset. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Beggs. Sterling.
Sir, as you know, I represent South Western Ambulance Service NHS Foundation Trust, to give it its full name, or SWAFT for short. I'm assisted by Mr. Riak of Bevan Britton LLP, and I'm here particularly with Mr. Wayne Darch, MBE, who is the SWAFT Deputy Director of Operations. He sits beside me. More importantly, particularly, he was the Head of Emergency Preparedness, Resilience and Response, who led SWAFT's response to this incident. And he will be attending with me throughout, along with other members of the SWAFT team. I'd like to start, sir, by reassuring you and Miss Sturgess's family that SWAFT are here to be fully committed to your inquiry and to your terms of reference. SWAFT are going to be open, constructive and honest, and will do the best, to the best of our abilities, to help you, sir, in your examination of the facts relating to the extraordinary events that happened in Amesbury and in Salisbury in 2018, and in understanding the response of all the public bodies to those events. Can I say we are acutely aware of the importance of this inquiry to Dawn's family and her friends, and of course to Mr. Rowley as well. As I've already said privately to Dawn's parents and wish to also say publicly on behalf of the organisation, we are so very sorry for your loss. And we join with you in your wish that this inquiry will bring to light the full facts of how it was that Dawn came to lose her life, wrapped up as an innocent victim of what was an unconscionable attack on the Scripples. It's hard to imagine, sir, what it must feel like for Dawn's family to sit in this room with all of these lawyers, faced by all these purple signs with their mother, their daughter's name blazoned across them. No family would want to be in a position to have to experience their loved one's death as the heart of a public inquiry. And we do sincerely hope that you get all the answers that you want from this process. We fully recognise that Dawn's family particularly want to understand how it was that Dawn died when others who were exposed to Novichok survived. And our staff will do what they can to help you understand the answer to that question from SWAFT's perspective. Sir, can I give you some context by explaining a little bit about SWAFT and our service? We serve a population of 5.5 million people, and we provide ambulance services across 10,000 square miles, some 20% of mainland England. We employ 6,000 staff, mainly clinical and operational staff. That's paramedics, emergency care assistants, advanced technicians, nurse practitioners, and also GPs. We have around 900 volunteers, including community first responders, basics doctors, fire co-responders, and other ambulance service volunteers. And we have about 800 students in training in our organisation. And SWAFT and all of its staff and all of its volunteers dedicate their professional lives to assisting members of the public who need help. We operate a 24-hour clinical response to 999 calls to try and ensure that patients receive the right care as quickly as possible, whoever they are, wherever and whenever they need it. And it's a sad reality that in selflessly providing that care to others, our people on the front line also put themselves at risk. SWAFT staff work tirelessly for the public good alongside our partner agencies in health, in police and in the fire services. And the key objective we have is to deliver the best care to our public when they need us most. And we hope that vision was embodied and exemplified in Amesbury by our people who continued to offer aid and support to Charlie Rowley in June 2018, despite them having recognised already the extremely serious risk to themselves if, as they correctly suspected, Charlie had been exposed to a military-grade chemical weapon, and that was what was causing his ill health. I hope, sir, it'll come as no surprise to you to learn that SWAFT have already taken part in several reviews of these events 6 years ago. We have already reflected on the events of 2018, and we will be pleased to share through this public inquiry with you and the public the lessons from this tragedy that have already been learned and acted upon already and already disseminated to others, both nationally and internationally. But, sir, I also want to assure you, and particularly Dawn's family, that SWAFT is not complacent at all. We recognise that Dawn's family have today expressed the wish that her death is not in vain, and we fully support the role that your inquiry will have, sir, in identifying any further lessons that might be learned to make the public safer. And that's not just in Salisbury in the southwest, but in the whole of the UK, should any malicious actor ever again put all of our lives at risk from toxic nerve agents being deployed on our soil. Can I end, sir, by reiterating our absolute commitment to honesty and openness and transparency here, and the full support we offer you and Dawn's family in identifying and learning any further points. And we give you an assurance, sir, that we will act on your recommendations. Anything that can help the South West Ambulance Service making the public that we serve safer in the future will be welcome by us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Elam. Mr. Deakin.
Sergei and Yulia Skripal. Both Sergei and Yulia Skripal would like to express their sorrow at the death of Dawn Sturgess and to offer their deepest sympathies to her family and loved ones. Sergei and Yulia Skripal also express their sympathy to those who were injured in the course of this incident. And finally, Sergei and Yulia would like to express their profound gratitude to the emergency workers, police and hospital staff who risked their lives to help them. On the 4th of March 2018, Sergei and Yulia Skripal were attacked at Mr. Skripal's home in Salisbury with a Novichok nerve agent. They suffered serious injuries as a result. On the 5th of September 2018, the Prime Minister made a statement to Parliament in which he explained that the Salisbury attack was carried out by GRU officers and almost certainly approved at a senior level of the Russian state. On the 6th of September 2018, the United Kingdom's permanent representative to the United Nations made a statement to the United Nations attributing responsibility for the attack to Russia. Sergei and Yulia Skripal have no reason to doubt these conclusions. Sergei and Yulia keenly await the outcome of this inquiry. They look forward to better understanding the circumstances of the Salisbury attack, to considering the inquiry's conclusions as to who was responsible for that attack, and to being able to move on with their lives. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Deakin. Mr. O'Connor?
So that concludes the opening statements for today.
Yes. We will resume tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock?
10 o'clock, so yes.
10 o'clock tomorrow morning, please. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you all for your help today.